All right. Welcome to episode 7 of my Android developer live Q&A. This is Ryan, and I think it's going to be a good episode today. So, fortunately, my brain is working a lot better than the previous episode, so I think it's going to be fun. But what I wanted to do is let's just sort of kick things off with a couple of announcements. And also, as always, if this free content proves to be useful to you, then please consider hitting the like button down below. And also, I'll have a pinned comment down in the comment section in the recorded video with some more options if you'd like to support me further. So thank you very much, and let's begin. So what I wanted to start with today is just a few announcements here. So number one is that last week I put together a new tutorial series, which was basically the first sort of, well, there was 2 videos, but the first tutorial series that I ever did was an Android RecyclerView tutorial series, and to date it was kind of my most popular series. Now the thing about that is that when I made it originally, it was in March of 2016, and I just wasn't as good of a developer back then because that was over a year ago at this point. So while I didn't make any major mistakes with the actual implementation of the RecyclerView, there was a few. I didn't really structure it sort of well from an architectural standpoint, and there was just a lot of stuff that I wanted to improve with it. So last week what I decided to do is just get started rebuilding it. Now I was originally going to do what I expected to be something like a 45-minute to an hour-and-a-half video where I build the entire basic RecyclerView app on camera. Well, I did manage to get it on camera, but the let's say the second video turned out to be 2 hours and 30 minutes long. Now, I don't regret that because that is how long it took me to build and explain as I was building it a basic RecyclerView app. And in a moment, I'll just walk you through a demo for it because I think it's going to be an app which will be a little bit more useful. It's going to be useful beyond just being a RecyclerView tutorial, but yeah, so that was the first thing. First big announcement is that I have a new tutorial up. To date, the RecyclerView series has been my most popular series, and I've been rebuilding it bigger and better. So I'll put I think I have a link down in the description box below, but I just wanted to take you through the code really quickly and just show you what I got so far. So basically what happened was, so there was a couple different things that I did wrong. Of course, I just closed detail activity, which I wanted to see. There's a couple things I did kind of wrong from an architectural standpoint with the first application. So, but anyways, most importantly, what I wanted to do with this application is, and this is something I kind of realized both as someone who has the experience of being a beginner and also as someone who just kind of, you know, just from the feedback I got from my older videos. The thing about that stuff was I realized a lot of beginners were watching my tutorial on the RecyclerView, and when you're a beginner it can be very hard to tell when, unless someone like really explicitly says when you are sort of, you know, when someone is showing you something which is just like a specific implementation sort of tutorial versus how does this fit into an actual application. So what I decided to do with this particular tutorial is I wanted to sort of structure it in a way that gives hints as to how you would include a RecyclerView in an actual app, where it would kind of fit into the architecture, how you'd have the different parts of the architecture sort of talking to each other, and I even included a little bit of unit testing sort of work with it. So the repository is available down below, and I won't spend too much time on this because I've got questions to get to, but yeah, the application basically has 3 layers. I wanted to do a 3-layer architecture It's not necessarily model view controller, it's not necessarily model view presenter, it's not necessarily anything. It's just a 3-layer architecture. And I decided to divide that architecture up into a data layer, a logic layer, and a view layer. So anyways, if you're a beginner and you're kind of interested in for starters, learning how to build a recycler view, but B, if you would like to just see a basic 3-layer app, which is real close to something that I would build, obviously it's a much smaller scale, and if you would like sort of a tutorial where I build the entire thing in front of you on camera, then please consider checking out my new RecyclerView tutorial. So that's the first announcement. Let me just check the comments. What's up? We've got a couple people joining already. We've got Zlifer stopping by to say hello, and a couple other people, so thank you for joining me. Saman is asking me to make it short and sweet, and my response to that is that I'm not your monkey, so if you want I'm considering talking more about it, but that's okay. Anyway, sorry, I'm in a little bit of a punchy mood, so anyways. So that was the first announcement. The second announcement I'd like to make is I will be working on a Kotlin application. Like pretty much everything I do, it will be an open source application. I won't say anything more about it, but you can expect a basic Kotlin full app tutorial from me probably around a month from now. I don't like to give specific dates because I have a lot of projects going on and life kind of happens, but do expect a Kotlin tutorial. And one last announcement. And this is again just kind of a general announcement, but I've kind of got it set up where I'll have a little bit more sort of, I won't say spare time, I'll have a little bit, I'm only going to be doing 4 days a week at my day job. I'll have a more consistent schedule that way. So for July, I have really big plans for the channel. I won't talk about what those are yet, but I think it's going to be pretty awesome. I'm really into doing a lot more tutorials. For the past couple of months, basically what I was doing is I was really focusing on just improving my skills as a developer and then sort of taking people along with that. But now I'm at the point where I kind of need to focus a little more on just making some tutorials and getting some more views and stuff like that. But also at the same time, I'm a lot more comfortable and I understand where I am as a developer a lot better than I used to. So that's kind of given me some renewed confidence to start cranking some tutorials out because, you know, I've been doing this for over a year now. I've built a number of apps live on camera and I'm starting to get okay at it. So that's kind of nice. So yeah, that's basically it for our announcements, and let's just see if we have any questions so far. Awesome, got a couple people joining. So I don't have any questions yet, so what I'll do is I'll actually just jump straight into one of the questions that I got from my comments and messages. Let me just decide which one I'll tackle here. I think, yeah, let's go for the big one. So this is actually sort of the main question for this episode, and this question comes from Omar S. again, who has been asking some great questions. So I really appreciate that, and I will be messaging Omar S. soon and asking him for an email in order to add him to the Slack group. So here is Omar's question. So this was really, again, I like these questions because they're general. He's giving me an idea of who he is and kind of like where he's at as a developer, and sort of asking a pragmatic question about learning Android development, which are basically my favorite kind of questions to answer. So Omar's question is, as an undergraduate, is it okay to learn from tutorials on YouTube and StackOverflow, learn stuff from StackOverflow, and, you know, kind of just what I imagine his situation is he's got classes going on, most likely. Maybe he even has an Android specific class, but he's trying to get his undergraduate degree. He's trying to become a developer. And one of the things that, well, let me just share a bit of personal experience. I will get to some answers, but I just wanted to talk about what my experience was like as a developer. Because, amusingly enough, Omar, you've probably already made it further than I did before I dropped out of college. Maybe you're in university. And I just wanted to kind of share that experience because my experience was so I started developing Android in the summer of 2014. I had one semester, I had 3 classes of post-secondary. I had one introductory Java course, and I did have some experience with Java sort of outside of school, just a little bit playing around with Java EE, Java Enterprise Edition, but I didn't really make it anywhere. I got as far as like launching a basic web app to a Tomcat server, and that was about it. So when I started with Android, one of the first things I did is I decided, all right, I'm going to make a project. I'm just going to make an app that I want to build. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew that I wanted to make an app. And I decided to build a workout log. So it took me about a month to build an alpha. That was my deadline. I said I want an alpha build of this project in a month. And bear in mind that I was working full-time with split days off, so a month sort of turnaround time for a really ugly first app was actually a pretty accurate turnaround time, it turned out. So I created the alpha and it looked ugly, but it was working. Then I gave myself another month for a beta release, got that done, looked a little bit uglier. And then sort of by the end of summer, I had built what was sort of the first release version of Catalyst. It wasn't called that at this point. And it was a very interesting experience because basically when I started out, there was far, far fewer resources to learn from, especially for someone like me that didn't have the money to sort of afford courses. So I basically had 3 places where I could turn to for information for the most part. So number 1 was, of course, the Android docs. Now, I do really have to give credit to the Android team now because it appears that they're putting a lot more effort into their documentation being more accessible to people. I'm not saying that the documentation was bad back then or is bad now, but what I will say is that there are a lot of different articles, especially back then, where they would explain to you about some topic in Android, intents or something, and the way that they would explain it to you in the docs almost felt like they were talking to someone who already knew what the subject matter was, which was really frustrating. Like I'd look up maybe, what is an intent? And then I'd get this list of jargon and explanations which assumed that I knew all these things that I didn't, basically. So that was very frustrating. So generally what would happen is I would start by looking at the documentation, and then I'd get some keywords from the documentation, and then I'd hop onto StackOverflow or YouTube or whatever showed up first, and I would search that out. And if I found some code I could use, I would kind of slap it into my code without caring too much about it. And that was basically how in the beginning, for about the first year, most of my learning from Android was from the docs, StackOverflow, and YouTube. Now, I want to contrast that with my approach now, which is that at this point in my career, I'm about 3 years into developing Android apps. I almost never visit StackOverflow, certainly compared to before. Sometimes I'll hop on it. I don't watch I do watch YouTube videos, but mostly just presentations by awesome developers. But my main resource is actually now open source repositories from good developers, which is something I'll talk about in a minute. So the reason why I explained all that stuff is I want to talk about some challenges and sort of give you some insights. So really, I believe what you're asking, a part of his question was like, is it okay for me to be looking at YouTube and looking at Stack Overflow and taking stuff from there and putting it into your own apps? Is that a bad thing? Like the way Omar kind of phrased it, like, is that something I should be doing to improve my career? Are there pros and cons to it? That sort of thing. So, and of course, this is an opinion piece. So first and foremost, the thing about Stack Overflow and the thing about YouTube, well, let's just start with Stack Overflow. So if you're a beginner, here's my suggestion about using Stack Overflow. Use it for searching bugs. Use it for searching general topics. Feel free to, like, if there's something you're not sure about, you hop into the documentation and you get an explanation, which is just gives you more questions than you had when you first looked to answer the question. Feel free to hop on Stack Overflow and look at that for just like quick information. For starters, we all did it at some point. We all do it. I don't really do this much anymore, but try not to copy and paste code straight from Stack Overflow and then put it into your app. And if you do, and let's be honest here, we've all done it at some point, at least rewrite it. Don't just copy it character for character. Try not to just copy paste from Stack Overflow. You can, as a beginner, if you need like hints and you got to get your application working, by all means, you figure out what you need to do to get your thing working. As you become a better developer, I would invite that you stay away more and more from Stack Overflow. And the reason why is that, well, there's a couple reasons. Number one, anyone can put stuff up there. Sometimes that'll be someone who's really good at what they do. Sometimes that'll be someone who just wants to sell you on their blog post and their library and their opinions. Sometimes an answer which has a ton of upvotes applied back in 2013, but now we have better solutions. Things of that nature. So that's kind of the problem, a couple complications of Stack Overflow. As far as YouTube is concerned, I think YouTube is a wonderful resource. Also, like, for me, it's a lot easier to learn from presentations than it is just like reading text articles. So try and find YouTubers who produce good content, and just, again, sorry, my neck is sore. Again, just be wary of people who kind of want to just do a quick cash in. Just be, wary of that. If someone puts out like good open source repositories and things like that, and they have a good reputation as a developer, you can be a lot safer in taking their advice and using their open source code. But don't just take, if there's a random 10-minute video by so-and-so on some random topic, just be a little wary of that. So that's sort of YouTube. And most importantly, and this is sort of the thing that I think you should want to work towards, and I'll kind of relate this with another story. So about a year into my career as an Android developer, and now the thing is, when I say a year, you have to understand that this was not me just spending a year solid learning how to program. This was me doing this stuff an hour or two a day when I had time and when I wasn't like depressed and unmotivated and eating a bunch of junk food and stuff like that. About a year ago, I applied for a a year into my development career, I applied for a junior developer job at a local startup, a really well-respected local startup. And I didn't get the job. I did fairly well in the interview, but I just wasn't good enough as an Android developer, and I had no idea where I was at. And also, it turned out that what I was told was that they thought they were going to be able to take a junior developer on, but that just didn't work out. Maybe they were just being nice to me when they said that. But importantly, the lead Android developer there at the time was a really talented Android developer, and he had released a repository, open source. And this was sort of his coding challenge. So I didn't actually get to the coding challenge part, but he did mention that this repository is what a challenge would be based on. And so I had a look at this thing, and I wasn't really very aware that people put like release quality apps open source. I didn't know that that was really a thing because I just hadn't had much exposure to open source code. And I looked at this thing and it was amazing. It had an architecture to it. I didn't know what it was. I discovered later on that it was Model View Controller, but it had packages that, It had packages that made sense. It had classes that made sense. There was some, weird stuff, even some stuff that today I don't really agree with, but that's fine. He's a better developer than I am still. I won't mention the individual's name or the repository, but anyways, what happened at that point is when I had the chance to see what a real application, a real Android app looks like from a good developer, it changed my perspective so much. And that was sort of the point when I was like, holy crap, the thing that I need to be doing is spending way more time looking at good open source repositories and way less time doing the Stack Overflow thing, doing the cheap cache in YouTube video kind of thing. There are some great YouTube tutorials out there, but there are also some not so great ones. And that was a level up. I leveled up when I saw that. It was like, holy crap, this is a new level that I need to get to. So let me wrap this up sort of I'll try and just answer your question now. So again, the question was, as an undergraduate, is it okay to learn from tutorials on YouTube or Stack Overflow? Do I need to be concerned that might harm my career or that might have some major problems with it? And my answer to that is you need to rank your learning resources and you need to use them sort of effectively. Use them for what they are sort of meant for. So number one, Stack Overflow is great for solving bugs and looking up quick answers. If you have an issue with your application, you've got something that's not working, you've got like a specific bug you need to solve, Stack Overflow is great. And I'm at the point where I can kind of solve my own bugs 95% of the time. Barring that, I still use Stack Overflow on rare occasion for bug solving. YouTube is awesome. It's a really great resource, and I personally am a big fan of looking at sort of programming tutorials and learning resources which engage your visual intelligence, but that'll depend on what kind of learner primarily you are. I'm very visual. And number three, the Android docs are getting way better. They're still pretty impenetrable to beginners a lot of times, but I see that they're putting effort into improving their sort of developer documentation. So that the developer documentation is a great starting point. Start there just so you have an idea of keywords that you need to look up and you get a general sense of the approach. But if you're looking at stuff in the docs that doesn't make a lot of sense to you and it's not explained well, chances are it's just not being explained well. It's not actually really that complicated. And the last thing, and this is the most important for beginners, as much as possible, look for well-respected developers that have like lots of open source repositories. One thing I really suggest all the time is the Android Blueprints project, Android Architecture Blueprints, I think it's called. It's in the Google Samples repository on GitHub, and it's fantastic. It's a whole bunch of repositories written by really good developers, which show you how to build a basic app with like good structure, decent naming, and stuff like that. So that's sort of my answer to the question. Should you learn from Stack Overflow tutorials? Use them appropriately. Don't just copy and paste crap from Stack Overflow. Be really wary. Yeah, that I think I've basically answered the question. So that is my question, or my answer for Omar. And thank you very much for that wonderful question. So I'm going to shut up now, and let's see what other questions we've got. All right. Oh, interesting. Okay, that's a great question. All right, let me, I'll just write this one out. Okay. All right, so Zypher says, I'd like to get, sorry, one sec. Zypher is asking, I'd like to get started with design patterns. Could you recommend a book or resource? I'm kind of rephrasing his question a little bit. Now, so what I'm going to do is, before I answer your questions, Zypher, I'd just love to give any beginners watching a basic idea of what design patterns are. So now, before I continue, just be aware that the way that I'm going to explain a design pattern might be really different from how academics, people in computer science, might explain it. And that's because I learned them by building applications. I do have a good textbook, which I love, on design patterns, which I'll share with you. But yeah, my explanation might be a little bit different from the average one. So what is a design pattern? And this is a really wonderful sort of thing to get started with here. Okay, so a design pattern. So when you're building a software application, you have this thing that's sort of called the problem domain. And how I would describe that is, so I have to go to a practical example. Let's say we're building a note-taking application, just a note app. So in applications which have like an end user, someone using the thing, you've got someone interacting with it. And then you've got like your sort of framework, which would be like the Android operating system and stuff like that. And then because you're working with a note-taking app, you just kind of know that you're going to have to be saving data. So right off the bat, we've got these things that we know we will need to build a software application. So for example, in my RecyclerView, my new RecyclerView tutorial, I shared with people just a really basic application architecture design. I'll just hold it up right now. And basically what this is I'm drawing the classes and the architecture of the application. And this is something that is really useful for me, because what this allows me to do is, once I sort of get a rough sketch on paper, then I can think about it in my head, and it becomes very easy for me to think about software architecture. So how does this relate to design patterns? Well, it turns out that this problem domain, the things that our app must do in order for it to satisfy its description, the things that a note-taking app must do is it must take notes, it must take user input, it must sort of kind of manipulate that input, and it must be able to save it and things of that nature. The point I'm trying to get at is almost every application you will build, and this is particularly true of applications outside of like computer science, practical applications, they almost always look the same or very similar from an architectural standpoint. For example, the RecyclerView app has 3 layers. It's got a visual layer, it's got a logic layer, and it's got a data layer. So how design patterns work is it turns out that when you're building these things, you will tend to run into problems or things you need to solve, which really, really smart people have already thought a lot about. So knowing that, developers have created these things called design patterns. So my favorite design pattern, which I would like to share with you, and it's one of the most basic one. Do I have? I'm just trying to think. My favorite one is, let me just pull it up here. So Zleifer, to answer your question, a book which I really like, which was recommended to me from a friend of mine who's a good Java developer, is called Design Patterns Explained. I am not paid to say this. I just really like this book. Now, if you're a beginner, I don't know if you are, Zleifer in particular, but for beginners listening, this can be fairly intense stuff when you're just starting with it. It's complicated. It needs good explanation. Now let me share with you a basic design pattern, because I can babble about it and use words all day, but the best thing to do is to show you pictures, because design patterns translate very well to architecture. Like, let's say you were designing a building. So my favorite design pattern, which I'll just show you really quickly, is what this book calls the facade pattern. So I'll just show you the picture, and what I want you to notice is that you've got like a bunch of classes in this box kind of talking to each other. Oops. And then you've got this interface talking to these things out here. Now you might be wondering, you might be thinking like, Ryan, you're just pointing at a bunch of like empty boxes and one of them has the word interface. What does that have to do with building applications? Sit back and I'll explain. Okay. So let's open up I'm going to open up my RecyclerView repository here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the controller. And what I would like you to notice is that this controller object, let's not worry too much about what it is. Just know that it makes decisions. It's a logic center. It's the logic center of the app. It talks to a data source through an interface. Again, what it says right there, interface. I want you to think that the controller and the view, the visual part of the app, the Android stuff, model view presenter, controller kind of thing, is that stuff there. And then we have this interface, And then we've got these things out here. That is exactly what's going on in my code. This controller is talking to an interface. It's not talking to a specific concrete object. Why is that important? Well, let me give you a very practical understanding of why this is important, because it's really key. Did I switch back? Yep. So I don't actually know, here's the funny thing, I don't know what this thing's going to talk to by looking at this controller class, because it's just an interface. An interface doesn't have any implementation. Well, let me show you what concrete class this controller currently talks to, which is fake data source. Excuse me. And I want you to notice very specifically that this fake data source implements the data source interface. It implements the thing that this controller talks to, but the controller doesn't know that this is a fake data source. Why is that important? With the facade pattern, which is this thing, with the facade pattern, or sometimes I've seen it called the repository pattern, the rest of the app, the controller, the activity, all that stuff, it doesn't need to know or care whether it's talking to a fake test database, a Realm database, or an SQL database. I'm just making this up. I'm not saying these are specific things, but because this interface sort of acts as a boundary, the rest of the app can talk to any of these things as long as they respect the interface. So what's a practical thing? Let's say I was building an application like Facebook. I would want to have a local database, a local data source to store things temporarily. And then I would also want to have a remote database or a remote service that my app talks to. With the facade pattern, I can talk to different kinds of databases. It could be Realm, it could be SQL, it could be a REST service, all through the same interface. So hopefully you can kind of wrap your head around how important that is. It'll become more obvious later on when you start building these things. So that is basically an example of a design pattern. It's a problem which has been solved already, and it just makes sense to talk to these things through one interface. So hopefully I kind of explained. So I'm just going to write a definition of the design pattern, and then I'll talk a little bit more about resources. So a design pattern, when building applications, you'll tend to run into the same problems as pretty much any other application which you or any other developer must when building applications, you'll tend to run into the same problems as pretty much any other application you'll build. The problems will be, when building applications, you'll tend to run into the same problems. You'll tend to run into the same problems. It turns out that certain solutions to these problems are tried, true, and tested. These solutions or approaches are commonly referred to as design patterns. Sometimes these terms can get conflated or confused with other things like software architectures, sometimes referred to as software architecture patterns. And the thing you need to realize is that what really separates software architecture and patterns and all these different things is not a lot. It turns out that if you build apps in specific ways, if you follow software architecture patterns, to confuse things more, really what you're doing is you're building things in a way that solve the problem really well. So hopefully I've kind of given a decent overview or like a practical explanation of design patterns. Design patterns in software architecture are basically my favorite topic in software development. It's something that for I guess like genetic reasons, it's very easy for me to visualize software talking to each other and things like that. So it's an area of great personal interest to me, and when I'm more confident with it, and I'm already quite confident with it because I've been working with it a lot, I will be making extensive material on design patterns, on software architectures, on all that stuff, because I love it. And to finish this question off, the thing that is really cool about following design patterns and building your software to architecture is that it solves problems before they become problems. It's so hard to describe, but the way, if you build things in a way that makes sense, then problems which you normally would run into without following architectures and design patterns disappear, and solutions start to just appear. So the last thing I'll say is to give you a practical metaphor for software architecture and design patterns in really simple terms that I think will help you understand why this stuff is important. Let's just pretend that we are designing a house, just a basic house. Let me ask you, let's say we've got a particular part of this blueprint that we're designing, and it might even look kind of similar to that. We're designing blueprints, and this particular part of the blueprint we're building is called a kitchen. Let me ask you, does it make sense to put a toilet in the kitchen? Does it make sense to put a grill in your bedroom? No, it doesn't. And there are ways that you can design a house that make sense. And those ways can really be arrived at through experience and common sense. It's the same thing with software. Why do I divide my applications into layers? Like, where's my big, do I have my big architecture thing here? I don't know if I do, unfortunately, but whatever. Why does it make sense to divide things into layers? Well, it turns out that if you've got a class or a layer of your architecture which is responsible for logic and decision making, it probably shouldn't also be responsible for storing data. If you've got your activities or your view, your visual stuff, it most certainly should not be responsible for saving data. You can do everything in one huge activity. It's just a really stupid thing to do that will create a ton of problems for you. That's that. So yeah, anyways, the most, so Zleifer, just to, for you, I do suggest this book. However, there are lots of good resources for free online for learning design patterns. And the way that I learned design patterns is less through reading about them. This is an awesome book. But in building a lot of apps and looking at a lot of software architectures from open source code, that's how I kind of learned how to use them well. So anyways, that's it for that question. Thank you. That was a wonderful question. All right, I'm just going to take a moment's break here and run an ad. Also, if you've enjoyed the show so far, you can do me a favor and hit the like button down below. Or not if you don't feel like it. Whatever. And we'll be back in just a moment. Okay. So let's see here. What have we got? Abstraction. So Dally H, I have a question of yours that I'm going to answer now. I see you're asking about, excuse me, you're asking about abstraction of a data layer. Abstraction of data layer thing is in domain layer. I don't, yes. You would abstract the data layer. The domain would talk to an abstraction. To answer your question really quickly, just not going to really spend time talking about that one. But I do have a question by you, though, which I'll answer in a little bit. But I just wanted to get to some viewer questions here. Okay. Okay, this is an awesome question from Suman. Really wonderful questions today. I really appreciate that. Okay. So I'll just kind of read this question out. So this is from Suman. So basically what he's saying is that he's in a position, let me kind of just write this out and then, yeah. Suman asks, and I'm going to sort of paraphrase this. He's in a, he's in a position, I don't know why I keep changing the way the pronoun that I'm, okay. As someone who is sort of a, I'll say a junior developer, not an absolute beginner, but a junior developer. I think that's a fair characterization, who isn't quite able to fluently read open source repositories. As someone who's a sort of a junior developer, okay, I think I got it. Okay, so as someone who's sort of a junior developer who isn't quite able to read, fluently read open source repositories, are there any tips to help with this? So I understand where you're coming from, because I was in the same position before, because I talked earlier about the first sort of awesome open source repository that I found, and I had been developing apps for about a year, Android for about a year, not super intensely. And I could kind of see what was going on, but there was so much new to me that it was hard to kind of read these repositories. Are there any do I have any tips or tricks I can give you for understanding open source repositories? Here's the thing, Suman. The thing that I think you've got to do, and this is something I really harp on a lot, and I'm not just trying to like inflate myself here and inflate my ego here, but you're going to have to find repositories which are well explained. Because unfortunately, it's always wonderful when someone puts their open source code up and it's really good code, but it's not always explained well and it's not always named well. So what I would suggest to you is try and find repositories which kind of look like this. And now the thing about this is I'm at a bit of an unfair advantage here, because what I've done is I've built an app and I very, very deliberately spent a ton of time naming things intelligently and including lots of comments and things, and just explaining stuff. You need to try and find repositories which are well explained is the first thing. Not a lot of them are. The second thing which I would really suggest as a practical tip is, and this is the most important thing, if you found a repository you like and it's similar to something you want to build and it's open source, don't just copy and paste code and slap it into your app unless it's got a proper open source license on it. Think of a project you want to build, and sort of as you are building your own project, and challenge yourself a bit. You've been doing this for about a year, so it's time to challenge yourself a bit. Say to yourself, I want to build a to-do list app is a great thing. I want to build something like that. Challenge yourself to build it really well. Pick a software architecture. I don't care if it's Model View Presenter, Model View Controller. I don't care what it is. Pick something you are interested in. But whatever you pick, make sure you've got a good open source repository right beside. Even if it's not well explained, you've got your project and you're going to be actively solving problems. And then when a problem comes up, you look at the repository. This is my tip. Why is that a useful thing? Well, let's say I just find a repository. It's thousands of lines of code, and I'm trying to learn from that. Well, if I don't have a thing to anchor my learning, if I don't have a goal with what I'm learning, okay, I'm building a note-taking app. All right, first thing, how to save data. I don't know how to save data. Look at the repository. Second thing, I don't know how to write a presenter. Well, how do they do that in the repository? Okay, so then you kind of take that and you work it into your app, and you want to gradually work the open source good repository code and approaches and all that stuff into your stuff. And not only will that help you from a motivation standpoint because you're working on something you want to work on, it'll ground your learning, but also I totally forgot where I was going with that thought. I'm sorry, I just, my train of thought crashed. Do that. build your own project, but reference it with a really good open source repository. And what that will do is I've taken a couple courses on learning, cognition, how you learn. And one of the most important things is that, like, the worst way to learn would be to just open a repository and just look at it and then just try and go through the entire thing and maybe write down things like that. Arguably, the best way to learn is to have your own project, which makes the information in the repository relevant. And so all of a sudden you've got a reason to look at specific parts of the code. And then you'll be asking questions like, how does this fit into my app? Well, how did they do that here? That doesn't make sense. Oh, okay, now I understand. And it grounds what you're learning. And that will improve the speed at which you learn. It'll improve your learning process in general. And it'll just help you become a much better developer. So that's sort of my answer to that question is figure out your own project you want to build. Find an open source repository which is similar and from a good developer, a respected source. Build your project and reference the other repository as you do that. And I think that will help you ground your learning a lot better. Keep doing what you're doing, though. You're walking the right path, in my opinion. So I'm going to just answer. I'm going to try and answer. Dolly H has a question, and it's a really technical one, so I can't promise necessarily a great answer to this, but I can share some thoughts. So for the beginners watching this, unfortunately, for the next couple minutes that I answer this question, I am not going to be. This is advanced. This is a very advanced question. So, but I will. I'll answer probably one or two questions after this one. So if there are beginners, just stay tuned. But we're gonna get serious here for a minute because this is. Let me just write down the question because this is a good one. So, Dolly H, stay all the time. All the time. Dolly H asks, I'm not making fun of you. Awesome name. Dolly H asks, in Pause Trainer, why did you inject the presenters into activities and not into fragments? So this is a Dagger 2 dependency injection question. So I will try and share my thoughts on this, Mr. Dali. So let's look at Pause Trainer. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to open up the three layers of this thing. So we've got reminder detail fragment. Let's do reminder detail presenter, reminder detail activity, and let's do reminder service, I guess would be a useful reminder service. So basically what Dolly is asking is, so when you are structuring a model view presenter application and you are building it with, and you're using Dagger 2 dependency injection, there's problems that arise. There's different ways you can approach it. The way that I approached it initially is that I was injecting my presenters directly into my fragments. Now, that was before I was using Dagger 2 for dependency injection, and also my approach to dependency injection wasn't nearly as complete as it is now. What I do now is that I inject the presenter into the activity. So when the activity starts, which is, of course, initialized by the application class, it gets injected with a presenter. It gets provided with what it needs. And that, of course, comes from reminder detail component. So reminder detail present. It's been a while since I've looked at this thing. Module. I don't know, I'm confusing the hell out of myself. Never mind. So we've got reminder detail activity, and it gets given a presenter. So, and the way that it kind of gets given this thing is through this reminder detail presenter module. And the important thing I need to point out to you is that I don't inject I create the fragment, of course, in the activity. And when I go to create the reminder detail component, including this presenter, I give my reminder detail presenter module the fragment. I give it a fragment that's already created. What happens next is, of course, the presenter will get built, and then it has an constructor injection, a constructor annotated with the inject annotation. And it gets given this fragment as a view. It gets provided with that, and of course the rest of my dependency injection framework satisfies the reminder service and the scheduler provider. So the way that I approach dependency injection now, and sort of my general architecture, is that as much as possible, I treat my activities like containers. I treat it as the container that these different components are kind of placed into. So here's the really difficult part. You're asking me, why did I inject presenters into activities and not fragments? And I need just a moment to think about this, because there was a very specific implementation reason why I had to do that. And the problem is it's a problem I solved like a month ago. Really, all I can give you for now, unfortunately. I will try and revisit this in the next episode, because it's a really difficult question. Really, what I can give you is the reason why I had to start injecting the presenter into the activity and not injecting it here is because at the end of the day, I want my fragments to be views. I don't want them to be responsible for creating anything. I want my activities to be the containers which initialize the rest of my model view presenter components. And so with that knowledge, it makes more sense to me to inject the presenter into the detail activity. Why that is the case in terms of like a specific implementation reason, unfortunately, it's just not coming to me. So I'll have to try and answer your question better later. But I know the high level reason is that it didn't make more sense for my presenter, for my fragment, which is my view. I use fragments as views. It didn't make sense for them to have dependency injection and to be sort of saying get activity dot get application and creating. I didn't want this clump of code. In a nutshell, I didn't want this. Where's the thing? I didn't want this thing to be in my fragment. It didn't make sense for it to be there anymore, to be in onCreate here. There are other reasons why, and those other reasons are in order to satisfy the dependencies of this presenter, I need to do some kind of funny stuff, like including saying get application. And in order to do that in the presenter, I would have to say, I would have to say get activity dot get application component. And at the end of the day, it would have come from the activity anyway. So unfortunately, that's all I can share with you on that topic for now, because it's a really complex topic. But hopefully that at least gives you some idea. And I'll see if I can answer that better later. All right, so we're getting pretty far into this. I'm probably only going to do one more question, and then I'll call it a day for today. So let's just have a quick look and see if we have any more good questions. Oh, thank you. I don't know what I don't think your name is sort of a practical name, but maybe I'm confused. But I had someone say thank you and told me that I'm this person hopes that I have more followers and I'm awesome. Thank you very much. That's a very kind thing to say. I appreciate that. What else? What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna say, are there any more questions from beginners? Any just general kind of questions anyone has? Doesn't even need to be related to programming at this point. I'm kind of winding down. My brain's a bit tired. And I'm just going to say I'm going to give it another 2 minutes or so for one more question. And that'll be our episode for today after that. Thank you so much. It's been a really great episode. In the previous episode... Oh, excuse me. In the previous episode, I had some really good questions, but it was kind of a funny thing. So my friend had a birthday party, and one of the things about me, which is kind of funny, is that because of what I do and the amount I have to work every day, in order to maintain that kind of workload, I have to do very specific things. And kind of what those specific things are is I have to watch my diet very, very carefully. I have to plan my sleep very carefully. I have to exercise regularly. And all of those are things that I have to do. It's not a situation where I'm able to get up at 5:20 a.m., code for a couple hours, go work my day job and fry fish and grill burgers for 8 hours, and then come home and have like an hour of spare time and an hour in transit and all that stuff. Do that all over again for days and days and days in a row. And I'm not trying to sound like that's amazing. That is the workload that is required of me, and I'm not looking for sympathy or anything like that. I choose to do that. The only way I'm able to do that is to not do certain things. And for me, one of the biggest things is I'm very sensitive to carbohydrates and sugar. And when I eat carbohydrates and sugar, I go full ADD. And two things happen. Number one, I'll lose my train of thought constantly. And number two, my mouth will start moving and I'll start explaining something. And the picture in my head that I try to explain will have a lag time. So I'll be maybe talking about like some architecture thing, and then I'll be like, and then Yeah, anyways, blah, blah, blah. And there will be lag time. So in the previous episode, it was just awful because I was getting a whole bunch of really awesome questions and I had all this stuff planned out. But because I ate a bunch of cupcakes and ice cream and drank a bit of alcohol, which I used to drink a lot, not so much anymore because it also kind of messes my brain up. But um, I was not feeling good in the previous episode, but today was awesome. We've got great questions. My brain's working fairly well today, and I'm super excited about that. All right, so I'm gonna hop back into the chat. Enough babbling there. We'll see if there is one more question, and if not, I will call it a day. And it looks like that is it for today. All right, well, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful episode, and I am very, very excited about where this channel is going to be going in the next couple months. I've got really big plans. Also, one thing, I won't talk a whole lot about this because I won't, but a friend from the channel and a really great, awesome developer who I've gotten to know in Daryl is starting a project, and he has invited certain people to this project, and I'm very, very excited about it because the basic idea behind this project, without getting into any details, is it's going to be of the scope, quality, and approach, potentially. It depends on it's all an idea until it actually gets built. But the thing is, I'm confident that with the talent pool that we have and the interests and learning goals, particularly in things like machine learning, I think we're going to be building something potentially which will turn some heads. And I mean the heads of some very, very big companies. Because on a really serious note, I think schools, universities, and just learning in general is changing very rapidly. And I am a product. I am personally a product of things that awesome developers provided me for free online. And in order to pay that debt of gratitude, I would like to do the same thing. And what I see sort of is a shift from people. I see people starting to realize the value in sharing and learning and helping other people, especially online. And that's something which not only am I so lucky that I picked this time to become a developer, because I couldn't afford school. School is very expensive here. But that didn't matter because the resources are out there, and I plan on devoting a lot of energy into paying back that huge debt of gratitude that I have for all the wonderful people that took the time to give me good explanations and share their wonderful open source code with me for free. So to all those people, thank you. And to all the people watching my channel, stay tuned. I've got big plans. That's all for now. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.